Hello, and welcome back to Your Story Stinks, the podcast where I talk about terrible stories, bad narratives, and misbegotten ideas. Today we're going to talk about Lore Olympus. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that I have tried to record this several times. Lore Olympus is surprisingly hard to talk about. And not really for the reasons that you're probably thinking of. For whatever reason, Lore Olympus sort of falls into that Sherlock category where everybody critiques it for what I think are the wrong reasons. That doesn't mean that they're bad reasons, but I think that most of the critiques only focus on what I think are surface level arguments. Questions of things like, is this a feminist or anti-feminist retelling, to me are way beside the point. Because the problems with Lore Olympus go much, much deeper than that. The problems with Lore Olympus are structural. And yeah, we can talk about, like, the siding on the house, I guess, but it doesn't change the fact that the actual, like, structural integrity of the building is not good. So if you're expecting me to talk about, like, all the social issues and all of the various emotional beats, you're going to be disappointed, because I honestly don't think that any of those have really anything to do with whether or not Lore Olympus is good or bad. I think those are mostly personal in terms of whether or not you're going to like or dislike them. I actually think that Lore Olympus is kind of boring to talk about in some ways, because the reason that it's bad is the same reason that every other long-form serialized story suffers. Over time, the storyteller changes, the stakes have to constantly increase, and the focus is lost. And so everything that made it good, or at least interesting in the beginning, disappears as time goes on. When you really boil it down, Lore Olympus does not have any problems that aren't seen in something like Bleach, or One Piece, or Game of Thrones. They all suffer from the same sort of issues, which is the bigger the scope, the bigger your problems are going to be. The reason that I brought up Sherlock before is because when Sherlock was big, there were lots of takes about why it was good or bad, and then as soon as Sherlock ended, people actually, like, boiled it down and started looking beyond the gut feeling, surface level reactions, and started pulling apart the various reasons why structurally the writing wasn't good. And that's kind of what I want to do today. That's what I want to do right now. But before we can do that, we need to talk about what it does well, what it does correctly, what it does well enough that you as a person can get invested in it. Because it does have good qualities, and I think, in fact, if it had ended at a certain point, it would be a above average series. Does that mean it's great? No. It would still probably be like a 6 out of 10, but a 6 out of 10 is still above average. It's a C plus B minus effort, and honestly, that's not that bad when you talk about long-form serialized writing. So what does it do right? Why does it succeed? The real reason it succeeds, and the real reason why it works in the beginning, is because it's very focused. The writing is very tight in the beginning. The author is clearly focused on one, maybe two people, and their story. There are other characters that revolve around them, but this is the story of Persephone and Hades and how they got together. And if the story was just that, and ended with them getting together, it wouldn't be that bad. But problems arise almost immediately, because we have to talk about mythology and the interpretations of mythology, and this is where things get complicated, because I don't think you, at first, even need to know anything about mythology. The story barely has anything to do with mythology, aside from the names of the characters and the places that they are. In fact, that's one of its strong points. The reality of the situation is that these characters do not need to be gods. These characters do not need to be mythological in any way. The story being told is a very basic story of girl next door meets rich CEO and they fall in love through a bunch of circumstances. There are very traditional plot points that are told almost textbook, and it works. The fact is that if you changed all the names around, the story would still work. If you made them, I don't know, werewolves, this would still work. The fact that they're gods barely plays into it, really. And again, that's to its strength, because as soon as it starts being about, like, the gods and divine stuff, the whole thing falls apart. Because cosmologically, this is not a story that can handle those kinds of questions. Now, you'll notice that I'm not saying things like, oh, it gets mythology wrong. Oh, it tells mythology poorly. Oh, it's misunderstanding the myths. Oh, this isn't the correct mythology. You'll notice I'm not saying those things because those aren't really applicable when discussing Lore Olympus, I think. In fact, ironically, Lore Olympus adapts mythology almost better than most things because it doesn't bother to try and take stances on certain characters and certain ideas. The reality of the situation is that myths are religion, they're not literature. And so gods in mythology don't have to be consistent. Gods in mythology don't have to be good or evil. They just have to exist because they're explanations. They're not characters with internal consistency. Furthermore, what most people call the quote-unquote correct version are just one version that we have, and in fact, they'll often cite versions that contradict other mythology. For example, the one that I like to go back to all the time is Medusa, because everybody talks about Ovid's version. For those who don't know, Ovid's version of the Medusa myth focuses on Medusa, where she is raped by Poseidon, she is cursed by Athena, and then she is slain by Perseus. At every step of the way, she is wronged by authority figures who basically don't care about her at all. In Ovid's version of the telling, the gods are cruel and capricious, and they mostly just screw with mortals. But here's the thing. Ovid, as far as we know, made this version of the story up because we don't have any other sources that uses any of these plot points. Essentially, Ovid did what people claim Lore Olympus is doing, and apparently it's good when you're writing in the 1st century CE, but it's not okay when you're writing in 2024, I guess. The reality is that Ovid, like many writers who used mythological characters, was using them in order to express his own political beliefs. Ovid wrote the Metamorphosis when he was in exile, having pissed off Augustus, and so the gods are essentially stand-ins for Augustus himself. Ovid is writing from the perspective that people in positions of power are always bad, and they always exist to wrong the people who are below them. You know, people like Medusa, or Ovid. So looked at from that perspective, Lore Olympus doesn't really do anything new, it just continues the tradition of taking mythological characters and using them however you want. If you're a Spartan, Aphrodite is a war goddess. If you're Athenian, Aphrodite is a love goddess. Which story you choose to believe is probably down to your own personal beliefs and your own politics. That's just the nature of mythology. So when we're trying to sit down and talk about things like, is this a feminist retelling, it honestly just misses the point, because the author is choosing to use these characters as props, essentially, the same way that the ancient Greeks did. And that actually works in its favor, as I said. The reality is, the story doesn't need these characters to be gods at first. The fact that it does things like set it in a kind of sort of modern universe isn't particularly new either. The fact that the underworld has skyscrapers and cars and stuff is not particularly noteworthy. The fact that, the gods do things like wear polo shirts and play golf is not particularly interesting. And again, it's not really even focused on. And that's, again, to its benefit, because as I will talk about, the more it tries to talk about cosmology, the more the whole thing falls apart. Because again, the story works when it's tightly focused and entirely absorbed in the personal opinions and struggles of Persephone and Hades, and their interactions with the very few characters that they see all the time. The story doesn't need to talk about things like, oh, Persephone is a goddess and Demeter is a goddess and they have goddess problems. That's all just set dressing for the fact that they have issues as overbearing mother and child who wants to make them happy. When the story begins by focusing on a woman who's trying to come into her own and the man that she ends up falling in love with, that's where it works, because that's the part of the story that the author knows how to tell, and so you can tell that the author knows what they're doing when they're writing that part of the story. When the author is talking about things like the trauma after you've been raped, or the trauma of having to deal with child abuse, you can tell that the author knows how to actually write these things, because either the author is more interested in these topics, or it just works better for their writing style, because it allows the author to focus on individuals rather than the setting. Because the setting is a hot mess. I know I keep alluding to this, that the setting has problems without really going into it, but I need you all to understand what the good parts are so that you can understand what the bad parts are when the story widens its scope and essentially overburdens itself with too much stuff all at once. The story worked when it was about Persephone and Hades and a few other people who they happen to interact with. The story stops working when it tries to include way too many characters and way too many plot threads, because it simply can't sustain that many different things going on at once. Again, this is the problem with serialized storytelling. If the author gets interested in a certain character that is not the main character and their story, any amount of time that you're using to focus on those characters is taking away from your main characters, and vice versa, because again, you don't have infinite space to tell your story. The ability to tell a story week to week in some ways is a shackle as much as it is liberating, because yeah, you might think to yourself, oh, I can just do whatever I want week to week. Reality is that over time, things become messy. And as you add more characters, as you add more plot ideas, as you add more threads that you can pull on, you end up having to give some of them up. Or if you don't, you end up creating a situation where the whole thing might just collapse on top of you. To give you a good example of what that looks like without using Lore Olympus, One Piece is, in my opinion, one of the best examples of a story that is far too overburdened with way too many things, to the point where it's unclear what the actual story of One Piece even is, because the general plot threads are basically Group A goes to a place, screws everything up, and then leaves. Repeat ad nauseum. The story has been going on for over 1,000 chapters, and yet we still don't know what the One Piece is, and it's not clear that anywhere they go brings them any closer to finding it or achieving any of their dreams. In fact, finding it and achieving their dreams seems secondary to this recurring theme of go to a place, cause chaos, solve some problem that they only just now found out about, and then leave. The result of this is that in One Piece, the author has to constantly make up new characters, and new factions, and new places, and over time, this becomes extremely problematic because it's impossible to keep track of all these characters and their abilities and their places and their allegiances. It becomes way too complicated. And, like Lore Olympus, One Piece is sitting around and going, okay, well, in order to make everything kind of make sense, we need to expand the world. And so they add things like the world government. And then it's, oh, the world government isn't the problem. The real problem are these like 5 dudes who run the world government. But they're not even really the problem. There's other people who are pulling the strings. And also, there's a resistance movement. But that resistance movement is never going to come into play. And also, they're related to the main characters. And also, there's a main character who has a brother who's not his actual brother, who only comes into the story after his actual brother dies, because the author is just running out of ideas and throwing things at the wall as time goes by. Now, you, as listening to this, might think that's being unfair. In fact, you might really enjoy One Piece. I know lots of people who do, and that's fine. But you can't escape the underlying problems with the format. As time goes by, you add more characters, you add more plot threads, things tend to get very messy. Stories, simply put, were not designed to be told over 10 years in weekly format. The reality of the situation is that over time, people change, their ideas change, their desires change, sometimes very dramatically. Imagine if you had to tell a story starting 10 years ago. And the you of 10 years ago had to start telling this story that you would still have to be telling today. Speaking from personal experience, I don't think I could do that, because the person who I was 10 years ago is not who I am today. My interests, my desires, my outlook on life are completely different. A good example of how this can distort your story occurs in Naruto, of all things, where the author begins by writing a story about a character who is unliked by everybody, and he's outcast, and he's very rebellious because he wants attention, because he's an orphan, and he's cursed. His story then ends with that character being reincarnated Ninja Jesus. Not only that, but the author then puts himself in that character's shoes so that he writes that character as he himself sees himself as a father. Because over the course of the story, the writer became a father, and that weighs very heavily on him because who he was then is not who he is now, and that changes his outlook on the world. The result of this is that he starts off writing a character who is an underdog, and by the end, he has so many advantages and connections to so many lineages that he's not an underdog. He is practically a thoroughbred. So again, going back to Lore Olympus, this is not uncommon. These problems are intrinsic to the medium, and much better writers have failed to deal with the problems that Lore Olympus struggles with. And that's why it's kind of boring to try and dissect it this way, because ultimately you're just going, yeah, the author has the same problems that every other writer has. The reality is, to go back to Sherlock, Lore Olympus has the same problems that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had when he was writing Sherlock Holmes. That's why he killed off Sherlock Holmes, because he basically ran out of ideas to deal with and he got tired of writing the character. Lore Olympus, simply put, doesn't know how to end. It doesn't know what its ending is going to be. It doesn't know where its endpoint is. And as a result, it just sort of continues on like a boulder that's rolling downhill. It's not really going anywhere in particular, it's just continuing to move via momentum. And everything that's built up just kind of keeps it moving forward. Meanwhile, it's trying to whistle past the graveyard while problems like the law of diminishing returns constantly pop up. And this would probably be a great time to talk about this, because the law of diminishing returns is constantly on display in Lore Olympus. To give you some idea, in the beginning, when the series was still kind of good because it was still tightly focused, the rape of Persephone by Apollo is extremely, extremely intense. The story focuses very rightly on Persephone herself, her feelings, her struggles, and it is done over a very long time. We see, as the audience, every step of the journey, from how it happened to all of her various stages of coping and her various struggles when dealing with this very serious issue. But the hero's journey has to end sometime. At some point, you've gone full circle. And we see this in action. We see Persephone go from someone who is burdened, who has all of these conflicting emotions, to someone who accepts it. We see her go to therapy, and quite frankly, we see her get to a point where she, as a person, has not really moved past it, but she has grown as a person and accepted that it happened and accepted that it wasn't her fault. And we have seen her full journey as, this is a thing that happened to me and I'm not going to let it define me, etc., etc. We've seen the entire journey. And as you might imagine, that leaves a hole in the story, because the story doesn't end. Much in the same way that the hero's journey of these two characters fall in love and get married can't just end with them getting married, because then the series doesn't have anywhere to go. Again, this is something that lots of series struggle with. Most famously, every one of the CW superhero shows struggles with this concept of, what do we do once the characters are, like, in a stable relationship? Like, how do we handle this? Like, where do we go from here? The series, at first, fully understands that it can't dwell on certain things because the plot needs to progress. In some ways, at that point, the series is too insecure as a series to be too indulgent. Instead of wallowing, essentially, or over-focusing on these emotions to the point where it becomes repetitive, the series has actual pacing, and so it works. But again, at some point, your hero's journey has to end. And there's a giant hole in the series, because now the series can't really milk Persephone being a rape victim as its emotional sort of resonance. It has dealt with the fact that Persephone has issues with her mother, and so it can't really milk that, and so it doesn't really seem to know what to do or where to go. It still wants to have this sort of tone of, like, everybody is traumatized and everybody just doesn't deal with their trauma, apparently, but it doesn't really know how to pace any of it because it's not really focused on any one character during this point. Let me take a moment and expand on this to sort of demonstrate what I mean. In the absence of Persephone as victim, the series starts to focus on two other characters, Hera and Hades. But the problem is that their struggles are entirely different and moving in two separate directions. The hero's journey for Hades, where he is personally trying to overcome lingering trauma from his youth involving his father, is moving in a separate direction from Hera, whose trauma is that she was forced to pretend to love someone who is now obsessive and essentially stalking her mind. These two journeys are moving in separate directions. If we focus on Hera and her own personal growth, saying that she's basically done with this clingy hanger-on, we're not focusing on Hades, whose struggle is that he needs to really own the fact that he's an adult, that he didn't deserve any of it, and that he doesn't need to be afraid of his father anymore. Now you might be saying, hold on a moment, don't they have the same villain? And yes, they do. That's kind of the problem, because Kronos, as a figure, is central to both of their trauma, but their journeys are going in opposite directions. Their way of self-actualization does not involve them coming together against him. They, as individuals, do not share the same trauma at all, and so they can't exactly come together and sort of deal with the trauma together. If they did, it might make some sense, but they don't. I think it's fairly safe to say that the trauma of being in a forced relationship and then being stuck with a stalker is entirely different from the trauma of being abused by your father. Yes, you may technically bond over the fact that you were both traumatized by the same person, but your trauma is different, and the way you're going to handle it and overcome it is different. And as you can imagine, being bogged down with two different plots involving two kinds of trauma moving in opposite directions really causes emotional and tonal whiplash. You can't really go from one to the other smoothly the way that the author seems to want to. And again, you might be able to kind of justify this, except these are just two characters who are constantly trauma dumping among a plethora of characters who all have trauma and are all moving in different directions. The lack of focus on Persephone means that every other character is now fighting for that attention and that spotlight from the author. As a result, we get things like, oh, we're going to watch Demeter go to therapy while she talks about her own trauma involving her mother. Which, don't get me wrong, is worth doing, and there's plenty of parallels, but the problem is that it's very hard to transition from Demeter as antagonist to Demeter as figure we're supposed to feel bad for. And this is a problem. Why is it a problem? Because Demeter going from antagonistic figure to figure we're supposed to like and feel bad for means that when it tries to do the story of why does winter exist, the entire thing becomes a mess, and this is where we get into all of the cosmological implications. So strap in, because this is going to get complicated very quickly, because the author cannot decide what it wants its characters to be. As I said before, the story works when they're not really having to be gods. When Hades is just a CEO of a megacorporation who happens to run the underworld, the fact that he's the god of death almost doesn't matter. The fact that Persephone is a goddess of spring basically doesn't matter, because the setup is she's an intern from college working under him. The reality is that, yeah, Zeus is king of the gods, but he goes golfing and wears polo shirts. Like, there's not a huge amount of, like, hard and fast rules about how does this universe work. And that's because it's not important to the story. The fact that Persephone and Hades are mythological figures is really not relevant to the fact that these are two characters who are falling in love and the story is of their love. When it's focused on that journey, it's a very human story, and so the story doesn't need to be bogged down with questions like, what happens when Persephone enters the underworld? What happens when she makes pacts with elder beings of darkness? What does it matter if Zeus cuts off connection between the realms? Furthermore, how is this universe ordered and how is it ruled? Because they very distinctly show that the lots myth of, okay, they've overthrown the Titans, so now they're going to draw lots to see who gets what part of the universe, that still exists. But then you have things like, oh, Zeus is worried about the opinions of people who live on Olympus, which doesn't make any sense because he won the universe, or at least the sky, in the drawing of lots. So it's not a democracy because he's king of the gods. But he also apparently cares about opinion polls. And this is where the sort of inertia of unforeseen errors starts to pick up. Because when the author is explaining, okay, why do Demeter and Hades have beef? And it boils down to, at the beginning, when they defeated the Titans, and after they drew lots, Demeter said, hey, I'm goddess of the entire earth. I should be considered equal to you three. Zeus has the heavens, Poseidon has the seas, Hades has the underworld. That leaves most of the world still up for grabs, and as the goddess of the earth, I'm just as powerful as all of you. Hades says, no, I'm not going to let you do that because I don't want to give up my volcanoes, so you don't technically rule the earth, it's in dispute, and as a result, Zeus won't approve you. And so this creates a long-running rivalry between the two. Now, that's perfectly fine. Explaining why the goddess of the earth and the god of the underworld might have beef is perfectly reasonable. What is not perfectly reasonable is what this sets up and what it means, because keep in mind, the author has just confirmed that Demeter, as goddess of the earth, is essentially on equal footing with Zeus and Poseidon and Hades, which makes it very weird when she essentially loses control of the earth. So the real plot line is that Apollo, for whatever weird reason, is so insecure about what he did with Persephone and the fact that she rejects him that he goes to Uranus, and Uranus apparently is perfectly willing to help him engineer a global catastrophe. And so as a result, endless winter happens, and endless winter happening means that, you know, everybody's dying. And Demeter apparently can't do anything about it. This is, of course, blamed on Persephone by Apollo. But that, on its face, makes no sense, because at every point in the story it's been confirmed, again and again, that Persephone is not as strong as Demeter, who literally has managed the entire planet for seemingly thousands of years. And again, this causes another cosmological problem, because Apollo is hoping that having framed Hebe for murdering Zeus, or at least putting him into a coma, he's hoping to use this whole thing as an act of goodwill to prove to everyone that he should be king of the gods, which is, again, not how it works. Because, yeah, he's Zeus's son, but that's not how succession works. Like, he's trying to do things like, you know, go to the public and do public relations, and it's like, public relations shouldn't matter. This is a universe where they drew lots to figure out who got what part of the pie. The gods, on a regular basis, do not seem to do anything except hang around mostly, which would be mostly in line with their mythological beings. Like, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, before they start getting involved, they're just sort of chilling and hanging out on Olympus and doing it whatever the hell gods do. But this changes completely if they're now saying that, no, Olympus is not a mountain where the gods reside. Olympus is like a country which has laws, and the laws need to be executed. And so there's a line of succession and rules, and all of that falls in like the face of the fact that they still also need to like gather all the gods together to make decisions, and it's a giant mess, and all of it's just boring. None of it's interesting. None of this matters, like, to our story, because, again, the story's supposed to be about two characters, Persephone and Hades, and them falling in love. Adding in all of these other things, and all of these cosmological ideas, and these subterfuge plots, like it's I, Claudius, is not helpful, and not good for trying to, like, contain interest on this story. The whole thing just kind of falls apart because we're being dragged in too many directions by too many characters doing too many things, and none of it's particularly interesting. And this is, again, without even mentioning all of the side plots, which just seem to happen off screen, because, like any good story, I suppose, it has a time skip. And now normally, time skips exist to sort of separate your characters from the plots, in the sense of, like, they exist to make a bunch of things happen off screen that you don't want to have to sit out and write yourself. And that makes sense, except that's not why it's used here. All of the things that happen off screen are confusing and don't really add to the story, because Persephone being removed from Hades for such a long period of time is not, like, a part of her journey, really. Here's what I mean. If you were any other author, and you said, okay, there has to be a time skip, like, gun to your head, when you're writing the story of Hades and Persephone, there has to be a time skip somewhere. You have to put it in there. If you don't, someone's going to kill you. Like, where would you put it? I'm guessing 99% of people would put it at the point where you go, and they live happily ever after. Because time skips are great for ending stories and beginning new ones. Hey, our adventuring party just slew a dragon. Now we want to cut to 6 months later when we see what happened to them at the beginning of their next adventure. That's how time skips are supposed to work. But the time skip in this story happens before the ending. So what happens is you end up in the situation where it's like, okay, they have to be removed from each other, and then, okay, they're removed, but then they find their way back, and Kronos is loose, and also Dionysus is being born, and again, I haven't even focused on the fact that Dionysus is a character who's a baby, and you would think that, okay, we're going to talk about, like, a story where she has to raise a kid that's not hers, but that's not where they go with it. He's just a random background character as a child. Anyway, see, this is what I mean when you try to talk about one thing and there's just 40 other plot threads that collapse on top of you. Anyway, time skip happens, and then that leads into, ostensibly, our climax, where she makes a pact with the underworld to defeat Kronos, and then she gets married to Hades. So the time skip has happened before the climax, which is weird. Imagine if, for example, in Lord of the Rings, there was like a 6-month gap, like a 6-month time skip between the hobbits entering Mordor and them getting to Mount Doom. Like, imagine if it was like, okay, Minas Tirith has just been defended, the hobbits are in Mordor, and now we're just going to cut 6 months into the future. Like, all of a sudden, for no reason. Like, that's what happens in this story. It doesn't make any sense. Like, everything is out of order. What should happen is, again, Persephone marries Hades, and then there's a whole dust-up about it. Hades refuses to let his bride go, or, in this telling of the story, I guess, Persephone refuses to leave, and so there's a time skip where the realms are divided, and then it's, oh, she then needs to become bonded to the underworld in order to prevent Kronos from wreaking havoc in the universe, because some reason. You would come up with a reason at this point. But this allows your climax to be before your time skip, not after. No sane human being puts the time skip before your climax. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know why you would do it. It ruins the pacing. It just completely destroys any semblance of, like, build-up or tension, because you've gone from this really intense scene of everybody at war to them all being defeated immediately. Like, imagine if in the Battle of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings, if it's like, oh man, there are the armies, and we're on the wall, and then it just cut, and the next scene was like the Rohirrim and Gandalf showing up after the wall's been exploded, and everybody's dead. Like, imagine how jarring this would be, and how confusing this would be, and that's without mentioning all of the various intrapersonal relationships that apparently develop off-screen that we as individuals who are reading this don't get to see, and so we have zero idea of why they progressed in the way that they did. To give just one example of this, one of the main side characters in this series is Eros, which makes some sense. The story, ostensibly, is about the romance between two characters, so you would think that Eros, god of love, would, be involved in this. Now, his mother is Aphrodite, who is the one who gets the whole story moving, which is helpful, but again, the series wants to paint her almost as a victim, or at least a character who's sympathetic, which is a problem because, well, you can't have every single character be sympathetic. Which I guess is why all of the villains are like mustache-twirling psychopaths. Like, that become like cartoonishly evil. Like, Apollo sort of works as a god who is like always used to being loved, and so he can't imagine that he's not loved. But like, you want Aphrodite to be a jealous creature who, in her actions, sort of kinda causes the rape, but you also want her to be like trapped in a marriage with Ares, and so like she has all these kids by him, but she doesn't really raise them because Eros raises them. So she's just kind of like there, but the series wants her to have a happy ending because it's trying to say like that, okay, people can change and love is good, I guess. But so, okay, we need to back up a second because I feel like I'm missing context here, and I don't think any of this is going to make any sense unless I explain the story beats one-to-one to sort of articulate why this is a problem. So bear with me for a second. The setup is this. Aphrodite is married to Ares. Her son, by him, is Eros. Eros, who is a major side character, is in love with Psyche, who is, again, been cursed by Aphrodite, who, again, is not sympathetic in any of this. Apparently, Eros is raising all the kids because neither Aphrodite nor Ares make for good parents. So at no point in this story does Aphrodite ever come off like a character we're supposed to want to have a happy ending. Now, at some point, they introduce Hephaestus. Hephaestus is a kind of minor character in the story who also acts like a dick repeatedly, although you can kind of sort of understand it because he's got a whole bunch of other problems because he's Hephaestus, and myths are never really nice to Hephaestus in the beginning. Anyway, so Zeus has split the realms. Aphrodite is, afraid about the fact that, hey, I can't really do my job, or at least I can't tell my son who does everything for me to do his job of making the people who I want to fall in love, because I can't go into the mortal realm because the realms are split, so I can't do my job and now I'm useless. This happens over the course of like one chapter. Then, out of nowhere, Hephaestus is like, hey, I invented this machine that will allow you to shoot arrows of love across the realms. Why did I do this? Because I felt like making you happy, I guess. Because I guess I kind of like you. Again, no indication before this that, he was into her at any point. No indication that she would be into him. But again, because I guess mythology says that they got together, they have to explain why they're together. Now, again, there's no reason to force this myth into the forefront like this, because all of this development happens in about 2 chapters, and then there's a time skip, and apparently Aphrodite has divorced Ares, who is not taking it well, and married Hephaestus, and they now apparently have a perfectly wonderful relationship. So, for those of you keeping score at home, we have a terrible person who we don't like because she's been set up as essentially a secondary villain for most of the story, hooking up with a guy who is a secondary villain for like 1 arc, and they live happily ever after. Meanwhile, Ares is just like heartbroken and constantly depressed now, and their entire relationship happens off screen. So we don't know what happened or why they got together, other than the fact that they basically did the equivalent of having coffee once, as far as we know, and then immediately getting married. Now, some people might be like, hey, couldn't you make an entire story about, I don't know, how these two got together, about, you know, Aphrodite's love life, and maybe, I don't know, humanize her a little bit by explaining why she's the way she is, and maybe, you know, explaining why Hephaestus is the way he is, and maybe showing how these two people could get together. And yeah, you could do that. It would take a lot of chapters, but it might be, you know, interesting and fit with the theme of these aren't really gods, they're just people who are in the positions of gods, but they really just have human problems. And that's all more thought than the author has ever given to any of this. Because the author is suffering under the weight of past decisions and the scope of their story. Because they are trying to force Persephone into this role as center point of the universe, and it just doesn't work. And here is where we talk about that. Okay, so the thing about this story is, as I've said ad nauseum, it moves from the human realm of these are individuals with human problems like our relationships, and it moves into the realm of cosmological importance, where Persephone is a fertility goddess, and fertility goddesses are special in the same way that Naruto is descendant from Ninja Space Jesus, and so he's special. She is in a long line of super powerful goddesses who can empower gods, apparently. And this is how, you know, Kronos ruled the universe, because Rhea was a fertility goddess, and then Metis was a fertility goddess, but then Zeus ate her. Or at least in mythology, he ate her, and that's how Athena was created. But Athena exists, and I don't remember off the top of my head if he ate her or if she just like disappeared, and if so, I don't know where Athena came from, and honestly I just don't care enough to like go back and try to read the wiki to remember all this shit, because it really doesn't matter. The point is that Persephone is super special, and she has all these connections with various beings, and it weighs very heavily on her, because you see, Zeus has always been super paranoid about, you know, fertility goddesses or something, which I guess makes sense because he thinks that they'll be a threat to his power, but again, she's marrying Hades, and unless Hades suddenly wants to rule the universe, which he's never shown any interest in doing, there's really no reason to be worried about this. You could try to do something where it's like, oh, the Greek hero has a prophecy and he causes it to happen by trying to avoid it, but that's not what they're doing with the story, because it's not really Zeus who is portrayed as the enemy as much as Apollo is. And again, this is all way more complicated than it needs to be in terms of narrative structure. But Persephone, over the course of the story, can't just be an individual who becomes self-actualized and comes into her own. It can't just be a story about a woman who is raped and then has to overcome the trauma. It can't just be a story about a woman with severe self-doubts and struggling under the constant overbearing pressure of her mother, learning to be her own person, because all of these stories would involve her not being the center of the universe, morally or otherwise. Persephone starts off as a character who is innocent, who over time loses her innocence and struggles with this. And that's a perfectly good story to tell, which is why in the beginning it works. it fails when she's like, oh, I'm also a fertility goddess and I have to hide my existence, and oh, by the way, I've now made a bond with the underworld, so I'm queen of the underworld, and so I'm a girl boss, but I'm not, because I'm constantly, like, unable to just voice basic things about myself, and I'm constantly, like, self-doubting out of my mind for no reason. Like, this is another point, which I'm sure lots of people talk about, which I think is a little overblown, but which narratively creates a feedback loop where it starts to feel repetitive. Because you would think that after, like, the 50th time of Persephone and Hades having a, oh, I'm so worried, like, talk at each other, because they don't really talk with each other when they have these conversations. It's more like two people talking past each other, where Persephone's like, I'm super worried about X, and Hades is like, I have to protect you because Y, and they don't ever really reach any kind of consensus. They just sort of agree, and then, like, 5 chapters go by, and then they have the same conversation again. And it just sort of repeats, because, again, the hero's journey is over. Like, the hero's journey has run its course, and Persephone has gone on this journey and come out the other side, and so now she needs a new journey of some kind, or she's just treading water. And the reality is that the author has chosen to have her tread water while it establishes that she is the most important being in the known universe. She is the linchpin from which everything else follows. She is a fertility goddess, as I said, which is like super special magic powers. She is also the one thing that could cause Apollo to fail, apparently, despite the fact that she legitimately does not give a shit about Apollo at any point. She is, again, also queen of the underworld, and also apparently, like, the known ruler of the underworld, in the sense of, like, Erebus and Tartarus have accepted her as the ruler now by giving her the pomegranate, which again is undermining the whole story. Again, which isn't necessarily a problem, but the problem is by undermining the story, it just makes it seem like she's the Fisher King. So, for those of you who don't know what I'm referencing, because it's King Arthur lore, the story of the Fisher King is involved in their search for the Holy Grail, and I can't remember if it's Gawain or Percival who meets the Fisher King, but essentially what they do is the knight, whoever they are, because I can't remember off the top of my head, shows up in this place and everything's ruined. All the crops are dead, the castle's in ruins, everybody's dead, basically. It's a disaster area. It looks like the end point of a Godzilla movie. And there the knight meets a man who is fishing. He's an old man, he's in rags. I think he's lame. I think one of his legs doesn't work, or maybe he's missing an arm, or maybe he's just impotent. The point is that he can't rule under, like, normal circumstances. And the whole lesson is meant to be that when the king is well, the kingdom prospers. And when the king isn't well, the kingdom suffers. And this seems to be what the author of Lore Olympus wants for Persephone, where when Persephone is confident and she's on cloud 9 and she's super happy with Hades, everything is good. In the fact of, like, the realm itself works. But when she's, like, insecure and she doesn't know what to do with herself, the whole world just sort of ends. Like, disasters happen, and what the author seems to be building towards is this idea that she's going to come into her own as savior figure of the universe. And that's just not a very compelling story for this. I've heard it said that this is sort of like 50 Shades of Grey if it was mythological. And that's not fair, because 50 Shades of Grey is much worse, and the author thinks that, like, BDSM is abuse in 50 Shades of Grey. This is a series that wants to explore trauma and wants to explore, like, deep personal relationships. And when it does that, it works. But the problem is that it's constantly bogged down by all of this other stuff. It's constantly being forced away from its comfort zone, which is writing a character who is a fish out of water, who doesn't always understand everything and is basically doing her best. And instead, it's like, no, let's take this character and make her a savior figure for the universe. These two things are competing with one another, and you can't have it both ways. Frodo Baggins cannot also be Aragorn, okay? You can't have Luke Skywalker also be Darth Vader. You need to sort of pick one. This sort of goes into the structural issues that I was talking about before, because lots of choices on the hero's journey become mutually exclusive. You can't go on the journey and then go back and redo the journey having already done the journey, because it's not the same journey anymore. You can't both save the dragon and kill it. And I don't mean in the sense of like, oh, you saved it by killing it. I mean, you literally cannot have your cake and eat it. You must make a choice. That's why the journey is worth going on. This is, actually, why most stories involve, like, 21-year-olds, because at that point, you're barely formed as a human being. You haven't made a bunch of choices that have likely shaped your entire world. You haven't done anything, really, that's going to lock you in the same way that, say, a character who is 50 is going to be locked into the choices that they've been making for 30 years. The author essentially wants Persephone to have the freedom to be the center of everything the way that they could be at the beginning of the story, but it's not the beginning of the story anymore. And so, as a result, her character becomes very hard to pin down, because she just happens to be whatever she needs to be for that moment, acting as though the choices she's making or being forced to make by the writer are not actually mutually exclusive. In other words, we started with a story about a girl overcoming trauma, and that is mutually exclusive with a girl who hasn't overcome that trauma. Now, you could say that there is such a thing as lingering trauma, and that's true. But what I'm getting at is, if you want to have the emotional payoff for the audience of, I have overcome this, and I am better than I was before, etc., etc., you can't constantly act like that didn't happen to milk things in the future. To give you an example from Star Wars, and why the sequels don't work, Luke in the original trilogy has a very simple hero's journey. He confronts everything he's afraid of. Like, the end of Empire Strikes Back is him confronting his worst fear. His father is Darth Vader, and he struggles to accept this. He doesn't want to believe that Darth Vader is his father. As a result, in Return of the Jedi, Luke overcomes this fear. He's no longer afraid of Darth Vader. He has conquered his fear. He has overcome it. He has grown as a character, which, again, is the hero's journey. And this is why in the sequels, his character regresses, because now, having overcome his greatest fear and having completed his hero's journey, he is suddenly portrayed as somebody who is still gripped by fear, essentially, and regret, and remorse, and he can't move past anything. And so they try to retell his arc again in fast motion, where he goes from an indecisive figure to a decisive one in one movie. And it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we've already seen his hero's journey. We've seen this character who starts off idealistic, who encounters fear and then has to overcome it. And because of this, he becomes a decisive, forward, heroic figure. When all of those traits are stripped away so that he can then learn the same thing he's already learned before, it feels repetitive. And that's where Persephone is. Persephone has gone on her hero's journey. She has encountered a horrible thing. She has encountered all manner of pressures and doubts and everything else that comes with, becoming a person. And over the course of the story, she goes on her hero's journey. She internalizes, processes, and overcomes these things. As a result, she becomes a more confident, a more forward, a more willing character. And so we see this and we're like, great. And this all culminates with her getting what she wants. That's the whole point of the story. We see her go from a character who can't say no to anyone to a character who is like, yeah, I'm going to tell my mother to go fuck off. I'm going to tell Zeus to go fuck off. I'm going to marry the man that I love, and no one's going to stop me, no matter what anyone says. And that is a hero's journey. As I said, that's where the journey should end. This is why in movies, after they kiss and fall in love, there's very little after. Most of the movies that you see that are romances are all about the setup. They're all about how did these two characters meet and then fall in love, because once they kiss and we as the audience understand that they're in love, the story's over. We've seen it. The rest is just like follow-up. You can fill out the rest of their life with, and they lived happily ever after. The story, ostensibly, should end for her character when she gets married, because she has now overcome everything that has gotten in her way and gotten what she wants. And if the story ended right there, it really wouldn't be that bad. In fact, arguably, most people, I think, would still have, issues with, is this feminist or not? But ultimately, this wouldn't be such a train wreck, because it would be, at the end of the day, such a basic romantic story. Yeah, they're gods, but that's really not all that important. The reality is that if it ended when the hero's journey ended, the author would get everything they wanted. The author would be able to focus on other stories, maybe cosmological ones, which would be, unburdened with all of this other stuff that has come before it. If, for example, the author wanted to go into, how did Hephaestus and Aphrodite get together, you could write an entire book about that. If you're really, really dead set on telling this story about how Apollo stole the crown and essentially turned the whole thing into a version of The Princess Bride, you can do that, I guess. But it wouldn't make sense to tack The Princess Bride onto, the end of another romance. You wouldn't tack The Princess Bride onto the end of, How Harry Met Sally. It wouldn't make any sense. You couldn't do that with the same characters. But Lore Olympus tries to, and that's why it all kind of fails. Everything becomes way too convoluted. The characters are stuck in this endless doom loop where they will proclaim that they are over things and then show again and again that they are not actually over anything, which you could argue is a very human trait for people to say, I'm never going to fall off the wagon again, only for them to fall off the wagon. But narratively speaking, it's extremely repetitive, especially when it happens over and over again in very quick succession. There's only so many times the audience can read, oh, Persephone's having self-doubt again, Hades is worried again, because that's all they do 90% of the time, it seems like. There's only so many times I can read that, or anyone can read that for that point, without feeling like we're just treading water. The author has lost track of the plot. And so when events occur to move the plot forward, it feels out of place. Because whether the author understands it or not, this sort of weird emotional morass is now the core of the story, where everything takes place. Before, we had a nice, structured plot where everything sort of moved together, and yeah, you could take a few detours, but by and large, the story was consistent, and it was plotted, and it had, like, key story beats that you could see coming, but you wanted to see them coming, because tropes aren't inherently bad as long as you do them right. And Lore Olympus did them right up until the point where it stopped doing them right, because I guess the story just had to continue. Again, there's a reason why romance movies don't get sequels, because we don't need to see the rest of the story. In fact, the rest of the story really isn't that interesting. Watching characters that we wanted to see fall in love have marital disputes just isn't that interesting. For those of you that are curious, as a side point, this is why next generation stories always fail. This is why they're never as good as the original. I don't care if you're Legend of Korra, I don't care if you're Boruto. They all have the same intrinsic problem, which is audiences do not want to see the characters they like grow old and die. That's not something they want to see. And they really don't want to see all of the bad decisions that these characters that they love made. They don't want to find things out like, oh, Toph was a bad mother, or Naruto doesn't have time for his son. Like, these are things that the audience fundamentally does not want to see. They are not interested in these things because whether we think it's corny or not, we like to think that everybody has a happy ending, and we like to be left alone to imagine what that's like. We don't want to see it, and we sure as shit don't want to have to compare it to everything that came before. Again, having to see Boruto and go, wow, you're not as cool as your father, is, again, a problem with doing next generation stories. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, what Lore Olympus is struggling with, because you're basically doing a next generation story inside your story. You're doing the 1.5 to your story. Like, okay, you had a clear, coherent beginning, middle, and end, and now you're doing the epilogue, but the epilogue is turning into its own thing. It's like, imagine if you want to make The Hobbit into, like, 3 movies. It would be impossible, and everything would get stretched out and convoluted, and nobody would be happy. That's Lore Olympus. And that's, like, all of the problems I can talk about without trying to go into, like, is this a feminist argument? Is this reductionist? Is this bad mythology? All these other things which make for good clickbait titles, but which I think are distractions from the fact that the story structure and the ideas which are underpinning the story are not good. You can't write a story like this and have it be good. There's no way to do it. Like, if the author wanted to write a story where Persephone and Hades getting married was just the end of Act 1, then you needed to make sure that Act 2 and 3 were fundamentally different in terms of emotions, or at the very least felt worthwhile and not like we were just rereading a worse version of what we've already read. In other words, The Godfather is great. The Godfather Part 2 understands that they couldn't just do The Godfather Part 1. It needed to be a continuation that felt wholly distinct from the first one. And then Godfather Part 3 came out, and it crapped all over this. Lore Olympus currently is in its Godfather Part 3 phase, because it doesn't know how to do a Godfather Part 2. It doesn't really know how to continue a story now that the story is over. Anyway, I feel like I've talked about this for long enough, but I hope that this has been coherent and at least educational, so that those of you who write stories of your own can go, oh, I'm going to learn from this, and I'm not going to make this mistake myself. Again, sequential storytelling or serialized storytelling looks great, but it really only works, and it only really benefits the author if the author has a clear idea of everything that they want to do and when they want to do it. If the author knows how to do things like pace themselves and has written the entire story in advance in their mind, then they can do like a long-term serialized sequential story. They can do serialization. But if the author has no idea where they're going, or is the sort of person who gets bogged down in details and distracted and is suffering from story bloat, then this is not the kind of story that you should be writing. This is not the method you should be writing it in. Lore Olympus would probably be a wonderful novel. Probably. Because it would force the author to write the entire story down in advance. If they sat down and were like, this is the entire story and we're going to adapt it into a comic, you could do that. But trying to write the entire thing on a weekly basis as a comic, yeah, that's not working anymore. Because it's clear that the author has stepped outside the bounds of what they had kind of planned out, and now they're really not working with things they're certain about. It feels ad hoc. It feels like they're reaching or they're flailing, and it doesn't ever seem to get better. They seem to be trying to add more details and add more characters and add more plot points to obscure the fact that they don't know where they're going with their story, narratively speaking, and that just makes the problem worse. If they really wanted to fix the story, if you want my opinion for whatever fucking reason as to how I would fix Lore Olympus, it would be to jettison all of this cosmological shit and just tell a story about these two characters and their love life. That's it. You could probably write a romantic comedy or a drama with just two characters, I don't know, being forced to go on a vacation somewhere. That would be more in line with the way the first act of Lore Olympus went. That would fit perfectly as a continuation of the tone and the writing style of the first part of Lore Olympus. The part that was actually good. Because writing a story where you're like, oh, I don't know, a rural girl who's never been on an expensive vacation, and I'm a rich guy who has never not been on an expensive vacation, and we are opposites, and we have to learn what the other person wants and what we like on a vacation. This sounds like a Hallmark movie because it is. This plotline fits perfectly in with the Lore Olympus that's not really so much about gods being gods as it is gods as stand-ins for humans and their emotional problems. You could write that story and it wouldn't feel out of place for Lore Olympus, because Lore Olympus is not American Gods. I don't even like American Gods because I think Neil Gaiman is also a guy who gets bogged down in all kinds of existential bullshit, even if it's well researched. Which is why I don't like Sandman. But not the point. Point is that at least he understands how to keep a consistent tone for what he's trying to write. American Gods knows what it is and isn't trying to be a focused romance novel. Lore Olympus is. Lore Olympus is trying to be a young adult coming-of-age story dealing with intense traumatic moments. And thus, it doesn't really work well when you're also trying to be Clash of the Titans. It just can't be. It just doesn't work that way. You can't be both. You just can't. It's just, you can't be everything to everyone. You need to pick a tone and stick with it. And preferably, you should stick with a tone that you're good at. Again, I think the first act or so of Lore Olympus is perfectly fine. It's above average. I've read so many bad, like, isekai and manhwa and webcomics and webtoons that are just absolutely terrible. The internet is suffering under a deluge of terrible cultivation stories. And the reality is that Lore Olympus is probably at a 75% or an 80%. It's a C+, B- effort, which is perfectly acceptable for what it is. But when it gets out of the initial romance story and becomes Clash of the Titans light, it easily dips down to like a D. It is barely passable and is not enjoyable at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure most people are probably reading just because they're wondering what on earth the author is going to try to pull next, which is probably not a good sign, based on what I see people saying about it every time a new chapter comes out. So, that is Lore Olympus. The story sucks. Well, it didn't suck, and now it sucks. So, yeah. I don't know what else to say about it. That's enough ranting about Lore Olympus. Hopefully this has made some sense, and hopefully I get back to making more episodes. I had to move, and like my whole life got like upset, and I had no idea what I was doing for a bit. So hopefully I can get back to like talking about things I care about and talking about stories. And one day I need to do an episode on Astro City, because Astro City is fucking amazing. So yeah, I guess if you're like, man, I need to, I don't know, think of something to read, and I've already gotten through like the first act of Lore Olympus, I don't know, go read Astro City. It's way better, has way better romances than this is. Yeah, that's it. Alright, see y'all later.